Okay, students, last time we were discussing about the alimentary canal, and in this alimentary canal, we discussed first about the mouth. We discussed various structures which are present in mouth. Now, this mouth it is followed by a tube-like structure known as pharynx. So, this pharynx it is it is a short tube-like structure, tube-like muscular structure, muscular structure. It measures just 12 to 14 centimeters in length. So buccal cavity is followed by a short muscular tube-like structure known as pharynx. This pharynx it measures just 12 to 14 centimeter in length. This pharynx it is divided into three parts. We can divide pharynx into three parts. One is known as oropharynx. Oropharynx. Another is known as nasopharynx. Nasopharynx. And its third part that is known as laryngopharynx. Laryngopharynx. This oropharynx it is the part of pharynx which is just behind the buccal cavity. So if this is our mouth, if this is the mouth, this is the buccal cavity. The part of pharynx which is just behind the buccal cavity, this part of pharynx. This part of pharynx is known as oropharynx. The part of pharynx which is just behind the buccal cavity. This is known as oropharynx. And the part of pharynx in which the nasal chambers open, internal nostrils open. This upper part of pharynx in which the internal nares open, in which the openings of nasal chambers open, right? This part of pharynx, upper part of pharynx, it is known as nasopharynx. And the lower part of pharynx, which opens into larynx. This lower part of pharynx, which opens into larynx. We have got two tube-like structures present in our neck. So this lower part of pharynx, which opens into larynx, this is the larynx, sound box. So this lower part of pharynx, which opens into larynx, this is known as laryngopharynx. So we can say there are three parts of pharynx. Although they are not demarcated internally, there is no boundary internally between them. The part of pharynx which is just behind the oral cavity, that is known as oropharynx. The part of pharynx into which the internal nares open, into which the nasal chambers open. This part, upper part of pharynx, it is known as nasopharynx. And the lower part of pharynx, which opens into larynx, that is known as laryngopharynx, right? So pharynx can be divided into three parts: oropharynx, the part behind the oral cavity; nasopharynx, the part in which internal nares open; and laryngopharynx, the part of pharynx which opens into this larynx, right? What is the function of this pharynx? This pharynx, as it is a muscular tube-like structure, its function is to take food from oral cavity into esophagus. So it is a passage for the food to go into esophagus. This wall of pharynx it is provided with voluntary muscles. Voluntary muscles. Pharyngeal wall is having voluntary muscles in it. So when we contract these pharyngeal muscles, tongue pushes the food bolus into pharynx. When we contract the pharyngeal muscle, then contraction of those pharyngeal muscles pushes the food bolus down the gullet, the opening of this esophagus. It is known as gullet. Opening of esophagus is known as gullet. So when the pharyngeal muscles contract, they push the food bolus into the gullet. So they help in the voluntary muscles of pharynx. They help us in deglutition. Deglutition. That means helping in swallowing of food. They help in the process of deglutition. They help in the process of swallowing of food. So pharynx, it serves as a passage for the food to enter into esophagus, and it is muscles. They are voluntary. They can be contracted voluntarily, right? So they help the food to be pushed into esophagus, and from esophagus the food goes into the stomach. Through this pharynx, inhaled air also passes. When we inhale the air through the nose, this air rushes through in the nasal chambers. Then through nasal chambers, it comes into internal nares. From internal nares, the air goes into larynx. So it serves also a passage for the inhaled air to go into the trachea and into the lungs, right? Or if we breathe air through our mouth, the inhaled air enters into the mouth, it goes into oropharynx. From oropharynx, it goes into laryngopharynx, right? So through this pharynx, in addition to food and water, air can also pass through this pharynx. So it serves as a passage for inhaled air or exhaled air. So we can inhale air through the pharynx into the lungs. We also exhale air out through this pharynx, either into the mouth or directly through the nose to the outside, right? So it has got two functions. It serves as a passage for the inhaled or exhaled air. It also serves as a passage for the food to enter into stomach, into esophagus. And it also helps us in deglutition of food. It helps us to drink water. It helps us to eat the food, to swallow the food. So this is the function of pharynx. So it is a short muscular tube-like structure, just 12 to 14 centimeter in length. Now, the point where pharynx leads into larynx or esophagus is having their two openings. So at the base of pharynx, we have got two openings. This opening is known as gullet, and this opening, which leads into larynx, this is known as glottis. So in laryngopharynx, there are two openings at its base. One opening which leads into larynx, that is known as glottis. Another opening which leads into esophagus, that is known as the gullet. This is esophagus. So in our neck, we have got two tube-like structures. The tube-like structure which is in front of, on the front side of the neck, that is the larynx and the trachea. And behind this larynx and trachea, we have got esophagus. So openings of both this esophagus and larynx, they are present at the base of pharynx. This opening of esophagus, it is known as gullet, and opening of larynx, it is known as glottis. So when food and water enters into pharynx, why does food only go into gullet? Why doesn't food go into this windpipe, larynx or trachea, right? So this glottis, it is guarded by a leaf-like structure. If this is glottis, the opening of the larynx, if this is glottis, this glottis on top is guarded by a leaf-like structure, leaf-like cartilage. This leaf-like cartilage, which guards the opening of this glottis, this is glottis, or it is a leaf-like cartilage. This leaf-like cartilage is known as epiglottis. So whenever we ingest food or water, whenever we are taking any food or water, that food or water directly goes into esophagus. That doesn't go normally into larynx. Why? Because when we ingest the food, when we are taking water, laryngeal muscles, they pull this larynx upwards. Laryngeal muscles pull this larynx upwards so that it meets the epiglottis, leaf-like cartilage. So that this leaf-like cartilage, it covers the glottis like a lid, so that food and water does not slip into this trachea or into this larynx. Sometimes when we are talking while eating, some food molecules, or some water droplet may slip into larynx, and immediately we develop a strong cough reflex. We cough till this particle or water droplet is removed out of the larynx, right? So why at that time this food particle or water droplet enters into larynx? So when we are talking, at the time of talking, we have to pass out the air, right? So at that time, this epiglottis, it does not keep this glottis completely closed. So when food and water is also present nearby, this is the esophagus. The opening of esophagus is gullet. It is not guarded by any covering, right? So food and water, they are supposed to go down the esophagus. But if this lid remains open, if it remains partially closed, some food molecules may slip into it, or some water droplets may slip into it, and that generates the cough reflex. So it is advisable when you are eating, at the time of eating, do not talk, because at that time, this epiglottis, it may not cover the glottis properly, and some food particles or liquid droplets may enter into larynx, and they will generate a strong cough reflex, right? So this creates a lot of problem at that time. So these two openings, gullet and the glottis, they are at the base of pharynx. They are at the base of laryngopharynx, right? So this pharynx, it is simply a passage for food and water and inhaled or exhaled air. So that is all about pharynx. Now this pharynx, it leads, because we are discussing digestive system. So we will discuss esophagus. Pharynx may lead into esophagus or it may lead into larynx. So we are discussing digestive system, so we will discuss esophagus this time. So from pharynx, the food goes into esophagus. This esophagus, it is also known as food pipe. It is also known as food pipe. So it is again a long muscular tube-like structure. Tube-like structure. It is again a muscular tube-like structure, measuring some 20 to 25 centimeters in length. This food pipe or esophagus, it is some 20 to 25 centimeters long, right? So what is its function? It carries food from pharynx to stomach. So its function is to carry the food from pharynx into stomach. So how does this esophagus carry this food down into stomach? Does the food slip down the esophagus? That is not the case. Food is pushed down the esophagus into stomach by a wave of contractions which spread along its walls. If this is esophagus, it is upper opening. It is known as gullet. So when the food enters into gullet, when the food bolus enters into gullet, this food bolus does not slip down. Then how it is carried down the esophagus? The wall of esophagus, it is muscular, as I told you. It has got both circular muscles and it has got both longitudinal muscles in its wall. The wall of esophagus is muscular. It has got both circular muscles. Circular muscles are like this, right? Longitudinal muscles, they run along the length. So when the food bolus is pushed from pharynx, when pharyngeal muscles contract, they push the food bolus into gullet. As the food bolus enters into gullet, then circular muscles of the esophagus, they contract around this food bolus. Circular muscles of the esophagus, the wall of esophagus, they contract around this food bolus. This wave of contraction, it travels down the esophagus. So it will push the food bolus downwards. This is the wave of contraction, it is traveling downwards. It is traveling downwards. It is pushing the food bolus down. So this wave of contraction, which is pushing the food bolus down, the esophagus. This wave of contraction is known as peristaltic wave. We call it as peristaltic wave. And this motion is known as peristaltic motion. Peristaltic motion. Or we simply call it as peristalsis. Peristalsis. So food does not slip down the esophagus. In our esophagus, the food bolus, it is pushed downwards by the help of contraction of circular muscles of the wall of esophagus. So this wave of contraction, which is produced at the gullet and then travels along the length of esophagus up to the cardiac stomach, the point where this esophagus, the point where this esophagus enters into stomach, that is guarded by a valve. If this is the esophagus, it runs down up to the stomach, then it joins the stomach. The joining of esophagus with stomach is guarded by a sphincter valve. This sphincter valve is known as cardiac sphincter. Cardiac sphincter. So when food bolus reaches to this cardiac sphincter by the peristaltic wave, this cardiac sphincter opens and it allows the food bolus to enter into the stomach. Once the food bolus has entered into the stomach, this cardiac sphincter closes down. It doesn't allow the food bolus to go back into esophagus, right? So the function of esophagus is to carry the food from pharynx into the stomach by peristalsis. So the point where this esophagus joins with the stomach is guarded by a valve known as cardiac sphincter. So when the food bolus reaches to cardiac sphincter, this cardiac sphincter opens and it allows the food bolus to enter into stomach. Once the food bolus entered into stomach, this cardiac sphincter again closes. So it doesn't allow the food to go back into esophagus, right? But sometimes we suffer from a disorder known as heartburn, or that is also known as reflux esophagitis. So what is the problem at that time? How gastric contents come back into our esophagus. Sometimes we experience that some acidic contents from stomach, they leak back into esophagus, and from esophagus they may come into our mouth. And we experience the acidity, the soreness of that fluid. So how does that occur? So that occurs when our this cardiac sphincter is not functioning normally. Because of some factors, because of smoking, because of spicy food, because of oily food, or because of some other medication. This cardiac sphincter does not close properly. It remains partially closed. So a space is left. Through that space, some acidic gastric contents, they may come back into esophagus. They may come back into esophagus. And from esophagus, these acidic gastric contents, they may go back into the pharynx or into the mouth, right? So that is due to malfunctioning of this cardiac sphincter. Mostly some practices like smoking, taking spicy food, taking oily food, eating junk food, that may cause irritation to this cardiac sphincter. And this cardiac sphincter remains partially open, allowing the gastric contents to go back into esophagus. And from esophagus, the fluids may come into our mouth and we experience the soreness of that fluid, right? So that is because of partial closing of this cardiac sphincter. So the function of esophagus is to carry food from pharynx into stomach. So how this food is carried? It is carried by a wave of peristalsis. It is carried by a wave of contraction, which travels from gullet to cardiac sphincter. So circular muscles of the esophagus, they contract around the food bowls. So when the circular muscles of esophagus contract over the food bowls, they push these food bowls downwards. So this wave of contraction is moving downwards. So it is pushing the food bowls downwards. The wave of contraction continues till the food bolus reaches to cardiac sphincter. When the food bolus reaches to cardiac sphincter relaxes, it opens, allowing the food bolus to enter into the stomach. Once the food bolus has entered into stomach, cardiac sphincter then closes, right? But sometimes, due to some irritation causing substances, this cardiac sphincter does not close properly, right? It remains partially closed, and some acidic gastric contents they may leak back into esophagus, causing that heartburn, burning sensation at the level of heart just behind the breastbone. So that burning sensation is caused due to acidic gastric contents, which are entering back into esophagus. Or sometimes these acidic contents they go slowly upwards and they reach into our pharynx, our mouth, and we experience the acidity, right? So that is because of this improper functioning of cardiac sphincter, right? So that is about the role of esophagus. So it is meant for taking the food from pharynx into stomach. Sometimes we vomit out our gastric contents. We suffer from vomiting. So how the solid food materials from stomach come back into our pharynx and mouth? In this heartburn, usually fluid portion of the fluid contents, liquid contents, they leak out back into the mouth. But at the time of vomiting, all the gastric contents are thrown out or thrown back into mouth and then out. So how does that occur? So that occurs by antiperistaltic movement. Normally, food enters into stomach through peristaltic movement. But sometimes, when we suffer from vomiting, at that time, due to antiperistaltic movement, so the wave of contraction starts from the stomach. Wave of contraction starts from stomach. That opens the cardiac sphincter. When the cardiac sphincter are open, then the acidic gastric contents, the food etc., which is present in our stomach, that is pushed back by antiperistaltic movement. Now the contraction starts from the cardiac sphincter. First, it starts from the stomach, then it spreads to cardiac sphincter, and then the contraction goes upwards, right? And it pushes the food into pharynx, and from pharynx, the food is expelled out through the mouth. So this vomiting, it is caused due to antiperistaltic movement. Vomiting is caused due to antiperistaltic movement. So peristaltic movement, it starts from gullet down into stomach. Antiperistaltic movement starts from stomach up to gullet, right? Causing the gastric contents to move in opposite direction, opening the cardiac sphincter and then taking all the gastric contents into pharynx and then from pharynx to outside the mouth, right? So that is all about esophagus. That is the role of esophagus. Now this esophagus, it is followed by stomach. We will see what is the role of stomach. Esophagus is not involved in any digestion process. The role of esophagus is only to carry the food from pharynx to stomach, or in case of vomiting, it may carry the food from stomach to the pharynx. So it serves as a passage for the food and water. Even water enters into stomach by peristaltic movement. If we have to drink water, that water, after putting it into mouth, it goes into pharynx. Pharynx pushes it. Pharynx pushes this water into esophagus. And by peristaltic movement, that water also enters into stomach. When the water enters into stomach, then the cardiac sphincter closes. So if after drinking water we will make a somersault, we will not vomit out the water. Now stomach. Stomach is another part of our digestive system. Stomach is a J-shaped, somewhat J-shaped, muscular sac-like structure. Sac-like structure. So our stomach, it is somewhat J-shaped, muscular sac-like structure. So its walls are formed of muscles and it is hollow internally. Our stomach measures 15 centimeter by 30 centimeter. So it is 15 centimeter wide and it is 30 centimeter long. Our stomach is 15 centimeter wide and 30 centimeter long. If this is the esophagus, this esophagus enters, joins with the stomach. So the point where esophagus joins with the stomach is guarded by a sphincter. And this sphincter, what is a sphincter? Sphincter is a band of circular muscle. A sphincter is a band of circular muscle. So this band of circular muscle, it is known as cardiac sphincter. Cardiac sphincter. Then stomach joins with the small intestine. And the point where stomach joins with the small intestine is also guarded by a sphincter. This is known as pyloric sphincter. Pyloric sphincter. So this stomach, it is somewhat J-shaped muscular structure. It is somewhat J-shaped muscular structure. It is hollow internally. That is why we call it as a sac-like structure. It measures 15 centimeters in width. 15 centimeters in width. And its length from this point to this point, it is 30 centimeters. So it is 15 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters long. Internally, it is hollow sac-like. Externally, we can divide the stomach into 4 distinguishable parts. Although there are no demarcation, but we can externally recognize 4 different regions of the stomach. This part of stomach, which projects above the cardiac sphincter, this part of stomach is known as fundus. The part of stomach which projects above the cardiac sphincter, that is known as fundus. The part of sphincter which surrounds the cardiac sphincter, it is known as cardiac stomach. Cardiac stomach. The part of stomach around the cardiac sphincter, that is known as cardiac stomach. The part of stomach which is towards the pyloric sphincter, this part of stomach which is towards the pyloric sphincter, this part of stomach is known as pyloric sphincter, pyloric stomach, or it is known as pylorus. It is known as pylorus or pyloric stomach or pyloric stomach. Then this middle part of the stomach, this middle part of the stomach, this is known as corpus or the main body of stomach, right? So we can externally divide stomach into 4 different regions. One is known as fundus. It is the part of stomach, dome-shaped part of stomach, which projects above the cardiac sphincter. This dome-shaped part of stomach which projects above the cardiac sphincter, it is known as fundus. The part of stomach which is around this cardiac sphincter, the part of stomach which is around this cardiac sphincter, it is known as cardiac stomach. The part of sphincter which is towards the pyloric sphincter, the part of stomach which is towards the pyloric sphincter, this is known as pylorus or pyloric stomach, right? And then the remaining part is known as corpus or the main body of stomach. So, stomach is externally looking like a J-shaped hollow sac-like structure. Internally, it is hollow. Internally, it is not having any divisions. In ruminants, the stomach is internally divided into different chambers: rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum, right? But in human beings, the stomach is not internally divided. Internally, it is in the form of a continuous sac-like structure. It is in the form of just a single sac-like structure. So externally, we recognize it as different parts. So we say the region of stomach, which projects above cardiac sphincter, we call that as fundus. The part of stomach which is around this cardiac sphincter, we call that as cardiac stomach. The part of stomach which is towards this pyloric sphincter, we call it pylorus or pyloric stomach. And the remaining part of the stomach, we call it corpus. So there are no boundaries, there are no demarcations. We superficially divide stomach into these four parts. Otherwise, it is simply in the form of a single sac-like structure, right? This wall of stomach, it is again muscular. Wall of stomach is stomach wall is muscular. It has got muscles in it. It has got circular muscles, longitudinal muscles in it. There are longitudinal muscles. There are circular muscles, right? And it is internally covered by a mucous membrane. It is internally covered by a mucous membrane, which protects it from the action of acids and enzymes, right? So internally, this wall of stomach, it is drawn into a series of irregular mucous membrane folds. The mucous membrane of stomach is drawn into a series of folds internally. This series of folds of mucous membrane, which are present in the luminal surface, in the lumen of stomach, we call these folds of mucous membrane as rugae. We call them as gastric rugae. We call them as gastric rugae. These rugae, they are lined by mucous membrane. They are lined by mucous membrane. And mucous membrane produces mucus. Mucous membrane produces mucus. So that mucus covers this luminal surface of stomach. The internal side of the stomach is covered by this mucus, which is produced by this mucous membrane. So mucus protects it from the action of acids and enzymes. And what is the function of these gastric rugae? These gastric rugae, they allow the expansion of the stomach wall to accommodate large volumes of food and water. Our stomach can accommodate approximately 3 liters of food and water. So when this food and water enters into our stomach, the wall of stomach can expand because it is internal surface, it is luminal surface that is drawn into irregular folds known as gastric rugae. These gastric rugae can expand. They can allow the expansion of the stomach so that food and water is accommodated in this stomach. And it is internally provided with a mucous membrane. That mucous membrane produces mucus. That mucus protects the stomach from the action of its own acids and enzymes, right? So this is the shape and size of the stomach. Now, what is the function of this stomach? This stomach, it stores the food. It stores the ingested food. Birds and some other animals, they may have crop. When birds take their food, they store their food in the crop. Then from crop, they send the food to the gizzard where the food is crushed. But in human beings, there is no crop. In human beings, there is no crop. There is no gizzard. So when we ingest the food, that ingested food directly goes into stomach, where it remains stored for some time. Where it remains stored for some time, right? So the first function of the stomach is to store the ingested food in it for varying periods of time, right? Then after that, digestion also occurs in the stomach. In stomach, there is usually digestion of protein. Stomach serves as the site for digestion of proteins. There is almost no or very little digestion of fats in stomach. Negligible amounts of fat. Negligible amounts of fat are digested in stomach. Digested in stomach. There is no digestion of carbohydrates in stomach. So stomach is the only site for protein digestion. So our stomach, it is mainly concerned with protein digestion, and it is also concerned with storing this ingested food and water for some time in it, right? So that is the main function of our stomach. So our stomach is not concerned with digestion of carbohydrates. It is not usually concerned with digestion of lipids, but a very small amount of lipids may be digested in the stomach. In stomach, the gastric glands, they produce gastric juice. In the wall of stomach, there are some 35 million gastric glands. In the wall of stomach, there are some 35 million gastric glands. These gastric glands, they produce gastric juice. They produce gastric juice. And this gastric juice, it has mainly got protein digesting enzymes in it. Gastric juice doesn't have any carbohydrate digesting enzyme. Gastric juice has a weak gastric lipase, a very weak gastric lipase, which carries out negligible fat digestion. But in the gastric juice, there is HCl, there is pepsin, actually there is pepsinogen, and there is protein. They help in the protein digestion, right? So the main function of our stomach is to store the ingested food and water for some time. After that, it is involved in the digestion of proteins mainly. It may store the food for some time, but its main function is the digestion of protein. So that is all about the stomach. This stomach, it unites with, it joins with the small intestine through a sphincter valve known as pyloric sphincter. So the food enters into stomach through cardiac sphincter, and the food leaves the stomach to enter into small intestine through this pyloric sphincter. These sphincters, they check the reverse movement of food, either into stomach or from the stomach, right? So that is the function of, that is about the stomach. Now this stomach, it opens into intestine. Now stomach opens into intestine. Intestine. Our intestines, they are divided into two parts: small intestine and large intestine. Small intestine, it is just 6 meters. It is approximately 6 meters long. Large intestine, it is 1.5 meters long. Small intestine is known as small intestine because it has got a small diameter as compared to large intestine. Its diameter is very less. Large intestine has got a large diameter. So it appears larger in shape. it appears smaller in shape. That is why this part of intestine, which is having less diameter, is known as small intestine, and this is known as large intestine. This small intestine, it is now divided into three parts. Small intestine can be divided into three parts. Its first part is known as duodenum. Its second part is known as jejunum. And its third part is known as ileum. Small intestine is divided into three parts. Its first part is known as duodenum. This duodenum, it is a U-shaped part or a C-shaped part. A U, or some authors call it as C-shaped part. C-shaped part. It is the first part of the small intestine. This duodenum, it is small, it is just 20 to 25 centimeter long. Duodenum is small part. It is just some 20 to 25 centimeter long. It is followed by jejunum. This jejunum, it is a coiled part. It measures some 2.4 meter in length. It is followed by ileum, a highly coiled part, some 3.6 meter in length. So how can we differentiate? There is no external demarcation between duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. We can recognize duodenum by its C-shaped or U-shaped shape, right? In small intestine, we can easily recognize duodenum because this duodenum is either U-shaped or C-shaped. But jejunum and ileum, they are just alike. So we cannot externally differentiate between jejunum and ileum. So how do we differentiate between these three parts of small intestine? As I told you, this small intestine, like stomach, it has also got a lumen. It has also got a lumen. This is the wall of small intestine. Inside the wall, there is an empty space. This empty space is known as lumen, right? In the lumen of duodenum, on the luminal surface of the duodenum, there are villi. There are villi, and those villi in duodenum, they are leaf-like. In duodenum, there are leaf-like villi. In duodenum, there are leaf-like. These are the leaf-like villi in duodenum. There are blood vessels in them. So in duodenum, there are leaf-like villi. In jejunum, there are tongue-like villi. Tongue-like villi. And in ileum, there are finger-like villi. So we can differentiate between duodenum, jejunum, and ileum on the basis of the shape of villi, which are present in its luminal surface. On this luminal surface, there are villi, right? So on the basis of shape of villi, we can differentiate between duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. In duodenum, there are leaf-like villi. In jejunum, there are tongue-like villi. These tongue-like villi are like this. They are somewhat tongue-like in appearance. And in this ileum, there are some finger-like villi. There are some finger-like villi in ileum, right? So we can clearly demarcate duodenum, jejunum, and ileum from each other by seeing their internal anatomy, right? Internal structure. So in duodenum, there are leaf-like villi, in jejunum, there are tongue-like villi, and in ileum, there are finger-like villi. Externally, we can only easily recognize duodenum because it is somewhat C-shaped or U-shaped. The duodenum is somewhat C-shaped or U-shaped. Jejunum and ileum, they are both coiled. Although there may be a bit more coiling in jejunum than ileum, but we cannot clearly differentiate between jejunum and ileum. So we can only recognize these two parts from each other by seeing their internal structure of the villi, right? So these are the three parts of small intestine: jejunum, and ileum. They are concerned with some different functions. We will see the functions of this small intestine and its structure tomorrow, inshallah. Thank you for being with me.